Today, let's talk about the Sega Nomad. Hello and welcome back to the Geek Cabal channel. My name is Jim, and today, let's talk about the Sega Nomad. The Sega Nomad was the follow-up to the Sega Game Gear, and Sega wanted to, for their second handheld, develop something obviously that was better than the Game Gear, but did not want to invest the money in putting in new hardware and all that stuff. So they looked at some existing tech they already had called the Megajet. The Megajet was a handheld Sega Genesis that was on an airplane and allowed passengers to be able to rent games and play them as they flew. They took that concept and then built the Sega Nomad from that. And the Sega Nomad is a handheld Sega Genesis. But it does have a couple of advantages to that I will show you when we get a little bit closer. But it has the ability to be hooked up to a television. It has the ability to have a power supply hooked up to it. So this actually uses the Model 2 Genesis power supply. And it also has an additional controller port, which again, I'll show these up a little bit closer when we do the close-up on that. Now, the Nomad here runs off 6 AA batteries. I'm assuming that they looked at the Game Gear and said, you know, the Game Gear really ate batteries like crazy. Let's add a few more batteries in there and then still have about the crappiest battery life that you could possibly have in a handheld. But the novelty is that you have the entire Sega library already there for this thing to use, and all you had to do was buy this, and now you could play those games on the go. At launch, these were about $179. It sold about 1 million units, and I'm assuming because of that price tag of $179, but I believe around the time this came out, I mean, the Sega Genesis was under $100 about that point. So why buy a handheld that barely has the juice to run for very long when you can just buy a Sega Genesis and still play those games? But what I like about this is the fact that you have a handheld Sega Genesis. You could take it to somebody's house that doesn't have a Sega Genesis, and now you have a console right here in the pocket of right here in the say your pocket, but a little big for your pocket, but in the palm of your hand. So even though this had sold 1 million units, it was still considered a commercial failure. So pretty much after that, Sega really didn't go back into the handheld market for anything like this, which is unfortunate because I see nowadays that's exactly what they're going for. I mean, the Nintendo Switch is this, but you can also hook it up to a TV, take it on the go, and I mean, here Sega was doing it, years and years ahead of that, and it just was the wrong time. The technology wasn't there, and unfortunately, it just didn't do well enough to get that many sales or come down in price or make it a little bit more accessible for other people. So why don't we go ahead and take a closer look at this and play some games on and see what it looks like.
Okay, so let's take an up-close look at the Sega Nomad. Up here on top, we've got the power switch. We've got the DC power in. This, again, uses the same as the Genesis Model 2 power supply. Cartridge port. And then we've got the AV out. This again uses the same one that the Sega Genesis Model 2 uses, and this is so you can output to a TV directly. And with the cartridge port, they make sure they state that cannot be used for the Sega CD because one, this doesn't have any ports on it for the Sega CD to plug into, and two, it cannot be used with the 32X adapter, which would be hilarious if you did that because the 32X adapter, if you've ever seen those, looks like a mushroom and is bigger than this actual unit here. So you'd have a separate unit on top, bigger than all of this, with its own power supply, and still there's not a cable that would feed into the 32X, because the way that would have to work is that this would have to feed into the 32X, and then the 32X would then feed out to the TV. So not something you're going to be able to do there. On the sides here, there are no switches or anything like that. It's rounded so that you can, grip it with your hand there. On the bottom, you have your volume switch, your headphone jack, your second player controller port, and your contrast to be able to adjust the screen. Then on the back, you have your battery pack, which holds the 6 AA's, which are supposed to be for 4 hours. But like I said, if you get an hour out of them, you're lucky. But again, I mean, this plays, Sega Genesis games, stuff that was meant to be played on TV. It plays it here, so as far as the cartridges go, it plays, like I said, just regular Sega Genesis games. Doesn't play any of the 32X. Doesn't play any of that. So let's get this turned on so you can see a little snippet here of some gameplay. Just the contrast so you can see it. The contrast switch is pretty nice because you can get the right viewing angle for you. But the one thing that becomes very apparent is that any game that moves with any speed can be very, very hard to see. And this was kind of the same problem that they had with the Sega Game Gear, where the screens had a lot of motion blur on them when you would be moving really fast. So, games like Sonic the Hedgehog would just look like a blur, which I get he's supposed to be fast, but if you're going to have blast processing with the Sega Genesis, you need to have a screen that can handle the blast processing. But, overall, the colors look good. The animation looks good. It's just that anytime anything gets a little bit fast, it gets a little bit hard to see. Now, I did mention that this works with all Sega Genesis games, but there are some Sega Genesis games that don't work with all Sega Genesis. And what I mean by that is that there were some companies that would try to make their own cartridges and get them to work in a Sega Genesis. Now, for the Model 1, this game here, Onslaught, we had bought this in the early 90s, brand new, and can never play this game. And from what I found out is that only early Model 1 Genesises were able to play this because of the lockout chips. So, I'm going to try this game in here and see what happens. And this is the same thing that we got when we tried it at our home many, 30 plus years ago, is that we got a blank screen. Nothing shows up. But with a little bit of absurdity, I bet we can get this to work. So what I mean by that is, let's put a Game Genie on top of this thing. And you talk about looking ridiculous. So first, let's do this. I'm going to put my already tall games. If you look at this game compared to this one, you've already got, height difference there. But why don't we make that height difference even more ridiculous by putting it on top of the Game Genie. Putting the Game Genie in there. So you can already see that if you went out in public with this, you would look freaking ridiculous. But hey, you know what? I like looking ridiculous. So get that set up so that I can get this turned on. And would you look at that? Well, at least we know the Game Genie's working. But what happens if we press start and move on into the actual game? Does that actually work? Oh my gosh, would you look at that? The game itself actually works. And the reasoning for this is that the Game Genie itself, because it goes into the cartridge or into the console first, has to have its own bypass of the lockout chip. And the Game Genie came out later, so they had a more modern way to circumvent that lockout. So we'll look at a little bit of gameplay here so you can get a... And you can see on this one here, the game moves a little bit slower, and with it moving a little slower, the screen blur is not nearly as bad. And the sound that you're hearing right now is turned up to full volume, so it's not a super impressively loud, but again, you do have the option for the headphone jack. Well, I guess it's very sensitive to movement there. So, would I recommend using this combination to get it to play on your Sega Nomad? Probably not. But that is all that I have today for you on the Sega Nomad. Again, thanks for watching. Do the normal YouTube stuff, your like, your comment, your shares, subscribes, all of that stuff. And if you like this content you see in here, let me know down in the comments below. I do have some more handhelds that I'd love to show everybody on here. And eventually, once we get the setup all done, even do some reviews and screen captures of actual game consoles as well. Again, thank you for watching.